I never imagined the day would come when my own daughter, my flesh and blood, would look me in the eyes and call me an extra mouth to feed. Not in a fit of rage, not through tears, but with the cold, calculated efficiency of someone explaining why the family goldfish had to be flushed. I had moved into her home only 3 months earlier, after a fall in my garden left me with a broken wrist and a shattered sense of independence. I didn't ask for luxury, just a corner to rest, a warm meal now and then, and the quiet comfort of being near family. But what I received was side glances, curt words, and a growing sense that I was no longer her mother, just a burden. The final straw came on a rainy Tuesday when she stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and said, "You've overstayed, Mom. We've got enough mouths to feed as it is. Maybe it's time you figured things out." No shouting, no tears. Just the tap of her manicured nails against her phone screen as she scrolled through takeout options, while I packed 2 small bags with what dignity I had left. They thought they were pushing out a frail, forgotten woman. What they didn't know, what they never bothered to ask, was who I was before the wrinkles and the gray hair. They'd forgotten my name wasn't just Mom. It was Elaine Langford, founder, investor, property owner, and unbeknownst to them, the silent buyer behind the LLC that had just acquired their entire apartment building. So when the eviction notices came, not for me, but for them, delivered with a quiet legal formality and a tripled rent invoice, well, let's just say justice has a curious way of showing up, polished, patient, and holding the deed. What follows is not a tale of revenge. It's a story of rediscovery, of a mother wronged, and of a woman who remembered her worth. If you've ever had someone turn on you, this story's for you. Now let's begin. The insult didn't come with raised voices or a dramatic exit. It wasn't delivered in a storm of anger or frustration. No, it came quietly, uttered with the same casual cruelty one might use to complain about rising grocery prices or a neighbor's overgrown lawn. We were in the kitchen, a place that once smelled of cinnamon and Sunday pot roasts, now reeking of passive aggression and store-bought silence. My daughter, Amelia, was chopping onions, sharp rhythmic strikes on the cutting board filling the dead space between us. I had offered to help. My wrist, though healed, still ached in the morning, but I could stir a pot or peel a carrot. She didn't even look up when she declined. "It's just easier if I do it," she said. "One less thing to manage." Then, as if the words had been waiting their moment, she exhaled and added, "It's just hard having an extra mouth to feed." The knife paused. My breath caught. She didn't flinch, didn't correct herself. She didn't notice, or didn't care, that I had frozen mid-step, hands curled around the back of the kitchen chair I'd occupied since arriving. An extra mouth to feed. I was her mother, the woman who nursed her through chickenpox, who skipped meals so she could afford Amelia's piano lessons, the woman who helped with down payments and wedding costs and babysat on late nights without asking for thanks. And now, I was just another mouth, an expense, a line item on the grocery bill. I didn't say anything. There was nothing I could say that wouldn't sound pathetic, or worse, needy. I went back to my room, the guest room, as she insisted on calling it, as if calling it your room would legitimize my presence somehow. I closed the door gently, even though I wanted to slam it hard enough to rattle the frames. I sat on the edge of the twin bed with the floral coverlet and stared at the faded photograph of her father on the nightstand. He would have known what to say. He always knew how to defend me when I wouldn't defend myself. But he was gone, and I had been trying, really trying, to stay strong. I didn't cry. Not then. I couldn't afford to. Tears had become a luxury, like kindness and warmth and being seen. I had left my home, my garden, my independence because Amelia said she wanted me close, said it would be easier for everyone. I'd believed her. Foolishly, perhaps. But now I saw the truth, plain and pitiless. I wasn't her guest. I was her burden. The moment passed like a cloud blocking the sun, sudden and cold, but not forever. In the stillness of that little room, I felt something shift. Not in her, but in me. A quiet realization blooming behind my ribs. I had been diminished in her eyes, but I didn't have to be small. Not anymore. Not ever again. After that day in the kitchen, the day I became an extra mouth, I began noticing all the little ways my presence no longer fit into the rhythm of Amelia's home. Things that once seemed innocuous took on a bitter edge, like fruit that had turned just enough to sting on the tongue. Mornings used to begin with a cup of tea and soft conversation. Now, I woke to silence. The kettle never boiled for two anymore, and when I offered to make breakfast, Amelia waved me off with a tight smile and a, "Don't worry about it, Mom. We've got it covered." We, meaning her, meaning I was not part of we anymore. The grandchildren I once rocked to sleep now passed by my door without a glance, too absorbed in their screens, or too instructed, perhaps, not to disturb Grandma. I didn't blame them. Children follow cues, and mine had been trained well. They'd stopped inviting me to their little school presentations or weekend soccer games. At first, I thought it was coincidence, a busy week, a missed message. But it wasn't. I had been quietly edited out of their lives like a sentence someone decides isn't necessary to the story anymore. I tried to keep my days purposeful. I watered the houseplants, folded laundry that wasn't mine, cleaned the windows no one asked me to clean. Amelia never complained outright. She didn't need to. Her gratitude had long been replaced by a kind of wary politeness, as though she were living with a stranger she hadn't expected to stay so long. Once, I heard her talking on the phone in the hallway. I wasn't meant to overhear it. That much was clear. "She's still here," she sighed, and then, after a pause, added, "No, it's not that she's done anything wrong. It's just, everything feels heavier, you know? Everything feels heavier." That was me now. Not her mother. Not the woman who once worked double shifts to keep food on the table. I was weight, bulk, baggage. In moments of solitude, I'd replay memories of our closeness, the soft nights after her father passed, when we cried together over old photo albums and talked for hours about nothing and everything. I had been her confidant then, her safe place. But time has a way of warping things. Need fades, and with it, affection. The woman who once held her hand in the dark had become an awkward guest overstaying her welcome. There was no confrontation, no blow-up. Amelia wasn't cruel. She was something more cutting, indifferent. And that hurt far worse than anger. At least anger burns. Indifference freezes. But frozen things, I've learned, can thaw, can shift, can become something else entirely when moved to the right heat. And as I folded my sweaters into a battered suitcase 2 weeks later, the same one I'd used when I moved in, I realized something vital. They had stopped seeing me. But I had just begun to see myself again. Once you've been labeled a burden, you begin to notice things differently. You start to see not what's said, but what isn't. Not what's done, but what's withheld. The warmth you assumed was implicit begins to feel manufactured, rehearsed. And soon, the tiniest gestures, what they think are throwaway moments, become unmistakable truths. I began to collect them, like crumbs dropped behind a child sneaking out of the kitchen, hoping not to be followed. It was in the way Amelia no longer set a place for me at the dinner table unless I asked. The way my favorite chair in the living room, the one closest to the window where I like to read in the afternoon sun, had suddenly become the designated laundry basket station. A pile of unfolded clothes always perched there, untouched for days, as if to say, "Not your seat anymore." The thermostat became a battlefield in silence. I'd raise it 2 degrees on chilly mornings, and like clockwork, she'd lower it an hour later without a word. "We keep it cooler to save on the electric bill," she mentioned one night, not looking at me. "The kids are used to it." I didn't argue. I simply added another layer to my sweater and tucked a blanket tighter around my knees. It wasn't about the temperature. It was about territory. Food became another quiet skirmish. Leftovers disappeared before I could get to them. Grocery runs no longer included the tea I liked, or the crackers I always paired with my soup. I began to recognize a pattern in the pantry. Only what the kids liked. Only what Amelia and her husband preferred. My favorites faded from the shelves like they'd never existed. Like I'd never existed. And then there were the looks. The exchanged glances when I entered a room mid-conversation. The subtle shift in tone. The way her husband, Greg, sighed just a bit louder when I turned on the hallway light past 9 o'clock. I had started tiptoeing through my daughter's house, a ghost haunting a life I used to be welcome in. The coldness didn't always come from them directly. Sometimes it came in absence. An unreturned text. A calendar invite that never came. The family photos on the hallway wall were recently updated. New frames, new smiles. I wasn't in a single one of them. Not even a candid from the holidays. They didn't ask me to leave. Not yet. But they were chipping away at my presence. One cold shoulder. One breadcrumb at a time. I saw it clearly now. The decision had been made in their hearts already. They were just waiting for me to catch up, to make it easier for them by doing what I'd always done, putting myself last and quietly disappearing. But this time, I wasn't going to vanish. I wasn't going to shuffle off like some forgotten extra. They wanted me to walk away. And so I would. But not without leaving something behind. Something they'd never forget. It was nearly midnight when I woke to the low murmur of voices down the hall. The house was still, save for the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the creak of old wood shifting under its own memories. At first, I thought it was the television. But as I sat up in the narrow guest bed, straining to hear, I realized it wasn't. It was Amelia and Greg, behind their closed door, talking in hushed tones, just loud enough to slice through the silence. I never meant to eavesdrop. Truly. But once you've been slowly erased from a place, you start listening for the evidence. The proof that you're not imagining it. That it's not all in your head. I crept out of bed, careful not to let the floor groan beneath me, and stood by the hallway just close enough to hear without being seen. "She's just always there," Greg said, his voice tight. "It's like we have no space anymore." "I know," Amelia sighed. "It's constant. I feel like I can't even breathe in my own kitchen." There was a pause, the kind that swells when guilt knocks on the door. But neither of them answered. Then, her voice, low and almost trembling, not with sadness, but frustration. "She's dead weight, Greg. I hate to say it, but she is. I'm juggling the kids, the bills, work, and now her. It's too much. Dead weight. Not my mother, not mom, just dead weight." The words landed in my chest like a dull thud, an anchor pulling something precious down to the ocean floor. I didn't hear the rest. I didn't need to. Whatever came after was just frosting on a cake made of bitterness. I slipped back to my room without a sound, each step feeling heavier than the last. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring into the dark, hands folded in my lap like a schoolgirl waiting to be scolded. There was no rage, no tears, only a strange clarity, the kind that arrives when the veil finally lifts. I had stayed in this house believing I was part of the family, that I was loved, needed. I thought I had earned that much after a lifetime of being their constant, their anchor. But now I knew. I was ballast. Something to be discarded when the ship felt too heavy. They weren't cruel people. not intentionally. But cruelty doesn't always show its teeth. Sometimes it wears the soft disguise of exhaustion. Sometimes it sounds like whispers behind a bedroom door. I lay back on the pillow and stared at the ceiling, 1,000 tiny thoughts scattering like starlings. And then, like a thread snapping loose from fabric, one thought returned, sharper than the rest. I had been cast off, written out. And if they wanted me gone so badly, then maybe I would give them exactly what they asked for, just not in the way they expected. It happened on a Thursday. The sky was clear, unnaturally so, the kind of brightness that felt almost cruel. I had just finished making my bed, fluffing the thin pillows the way I always did. Little rituals that gave me a sense of order, of purpose. Amelia knocked once on the guest room door and didn't wait for a response before opening it. She stepped inside with a softness that didn't match the weight of what she was about to say. Her arms were crossed, a folded laundry basket tucked under one elbow, like this conversation was just another item on her to-do list. "Mom," she said, and I already knew. The way her eyes didn't quite meet mine, the way she cleared her throat before continuing. "Greg and I have been talking. We think it's time for you to find something more suitable. Maybe a place of your own. Just somewhere quieter. You need your own space, you know?" She said it like she was doing me a favor, like being asked to leave was an opportunity. I didn't answer. I simply stood, smoothing down the hem of my cardigan, and let the silence stretch long enough for her to grow uncomfortable. "It's not that we don't love you," she added quickly. "It's just, with the kids and everything, it's too much. You understand, don't you?" I did understand. Not just her words, but what lay beneath them. She wanted her life back, her house, her rhythms, her uncluttered space. I was no longer her mother. I was a disruption, a living reminder of obligation. "I'll be out by the weekend," I said, my voice even. She looked surprised, maybe even a little relieved. She didn't expect grace, not after calling me dead weight, even if she thought I hadn't heard. She nodded and left without another word. I packed slowly. Not because I had much, just 2 worn suitcases, the kind that still bore stickers from past trips long before my bones began to ache. A few blouses, a photo of Amelia as a little girl with chocolate smeared on her cheek, and a worn paperback I never finished. That was all I had brought, and now all I would leave with. By Saturday morning, I stood on the curb with those 2 bags and no plan. She didn't even wait for a ride to come. Just kissed my cheek, dry and quick, and closed the front door behind her. No one else came out. No wave from the kids. No goodbye from Greg. It wasn't legal, this quiet removal. But it didn't need to be. It was done with smiles and a closed door, and that made it final. As I stood there, alone with the buzz of traffic and the scrape of wind on pavement, I felt something curious. Not grief, not anger, something closer to freedom. Because sometimes, the moment you're discarded is the exact moment you remember your worth. The cafe was nothing special, one of those corner places tucked between a dry cleaner and a real estate office, with peeling paint on the window trim and mismatched chairs that wobbled if you sat the wrong way. But it had warmth, the kind that doesn't come from fancy decor or curated playlists, but from the soft clink of ceramic mugs and the quiet murmur of strangers who knew when not to ask questions. I found it while wandering, bags in hand, pretending I had a destination. I didn't. Not really. But I needed somewhere to sit that wasn't a curb. I ordered a pot of Earl Grey, extra lemon, and chose a table near the window. The waitress, her name was Lila, small name tag pinned crooked over her heart, didn't look at me like I was lost. She looked at me like I was just another customer, which in that moment felt like mercy. I warmed my hands on the mug and stared out at the street. I hadn't cried. Not when Amelia closed the door. Not when I watched families pass by, hurrying home with groceries or squabbling toddlers in tow. I didn't cry, because something inside me had shifted. Something cold and still and sharp. At the next table, two men in suits were talking numbers, cap rates, tenant turnover, lease terms. My ears perked, not out of nosiness, but familiarity. I hadn't heard that language in years, but once it had been second nature. Before I became just mom, I'd worked in property management for nearly 2 decades. Before I was a guest in someone else's home, I was the woman people came to for answers, for signatures, for keys. And suddenly, it came to me. Not in a flash, but in the slow, steady crawl of something inevitable. They had kicked me out of their house, claimed I was too much, too old, too inconvenient. But they didn't know who I used to be, who I still was, beneath the layers of disappointment and softened edges. They saw a retired woman with a pension and 2 suitcases. They didn't know about the savings account, quietly growing compound interest. They didn't know about the equity I'd held onto, or the contacts I still kept in an old Rolodex tucked deep in storage. I didn't need revenge. I didn't want drama. What I wanted was restoration. Not of their respect. I was done waiting for that. But of mine. My name. My pride. My power. By the time the tea had gone cold and the suits had left, I had already made the first call. It was to a man named Carter Bishop, a commercial real estate broker who owed me a favor and never forgot a debt. My voice didn't shake. "Carter," I said, "I'm looking to buy a building. Something residential. Ideally with tenants." I could almost hear his grin through the phone. "Welcome back, Mrs. Langley." That was the moment everything changed. Not with a bang, but with a cup of tea and a plan. It's easy to forget yourself when everyone else calls you something else. For years, I answered only to mom, ma, grandma, even the occasional mother when Amelia was particularly annoyed. They roll off the tongue like nicknames, harmless enough until you realize they've swallowed your identity whole. Somewhere along the line, Elaine Langley had disappeared, folded beneath laundry baskets and dinner prep and bedtime stories. She'd been replaced with roles. Essential, yes, but roles nonetheless. Servant, caretaker, background noise. But in that cafe, with the memory of Carter's voice saying my name, I felt her again. Elaine. Not the tired, invisible woman shuffling through her daughter's house, but the one who used to wear pressed suits and walk into boardrooms with a planner tucked under one arm and 3 deals on the table. The woman who handled evictions and acquisitions in the same calm breath. The woman who once negotiated a lease so tight a hedge fund couldn't wiggle out of it without bleeding. Elaine Langley was never loud. She didn't need to be. She understood the power of stillness, of being underestimated. She smiled during silence and let people talk themselves into corners. She kept receipts, literal and emotional, and never raised her voice when a raised eyebrow would do. But that woman had gone quiet after George died. My husband, the only man who ever truly understood my strength without feeling threatened by it. When he passed, something in me dimmed. I retired early, too early, and convinced myself I was ready for a simpler life. I told Amelia I just wanted to be close to family, to help with the kids, to enjoy peace. But the truth was, I stopped seeing value in my own reflection. I traded my name for a title, Mom, and I wore it like armor, until it became a shroud. But now, with a plan forming, with Carter emailing listings and my phone vibrating with contacts who still remembered me, that old sense of self returned like a muscle waking up after a long sleep. I looked in the mirror that night, at the modest motel room I'd rented for the week until I found something more suitable, and said it aloud. Elaine Langley. The woman in the reflection didn't flinch. She lifted her chin slightly. She straightened her shoulders. She smoothed the front of her blouse like she was preparing to walk into a closing meeting and not the corner market. It wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition. Mine. Theirs would come later. I was no longer waiting to be seen. I wasn't the extra mouth. I wasn't the dead weight. I wasn't the problem they whispered about behind bedroom doors. I was Elaine Langley again. And I was about to become their landlord. Long before I became Elaine Langley again, I was Mrs. Langford. That was the name stamped on leases, contracts, and title deeds. A name that earned nods in quiet conference rooms and made banks return my calls within the hour. George always said I had a talent for timing. Not just knowing when to buy or sell, but when to wait, when to watch, when to move without fanfare. I never needed to announce my wins. I just let the numbers speak for me. We started small. A duplex on the east side, bought at auction for less than the cost of Amelia's wedding. We lived in one unit and rented out the other. I managed tenants, maintenance calls, the bookkeeping. George handled the renovations on weekends, always humming Sinatra off-key with a hammer in his hand. By the time Amelia started middle school, we had 5 properties. By her college graduation, we had 12. And when George passed, suddenly and without ceremony, I didn't crumble. Not publicly. Grief lived in the quiet corners, the unmade side of the bed, the unanswered questions in late-night silence. But the business kept me grounded. While others saw a widow, I saw leverage. I sold 2 underperforming buildings, paid off the mortgages on the rest, and restructured under a holding company. Langford Holdings, LLC. Sounded more impressive than it was, but sometimes names matter more than numbers. What no one knew, not even Amelia, was that I never stopped. Even after I handed off daily operations to a management firm, even after I moved closer to her, I kept investing. Quietly, efficiently. A 4-unit walk-up in the suburbs, a mixed-use brownstone in a gentrifying district. I had no office, no flashy website, just a P.O. box, a modest accountant, and an instinct honed by 30 years of watching people overlook older women as if wisdom expired with age. I was never the richest person in the room, but I never needed to be. I was liquid. I was leveraged. I was, as Carter once said, dangerously unassuming. So when I told him I was looking to buy a small building, something close to Amelia's, something with potential, he didn't ask why. He didn't smirk or comment on my circumstances. He just said, "Budget?" And I replied, "Comfortably 7 figures." A week later, I toured the listing. It was familiar in the worst way. Tired paint, peeling railings, and 8 units stacked like apologies. Tenants were months behind. The landlord had long since stopped pretending to care. And as fate would have it, one of those units, Unit 3C, belonged to my daughter. Carter raised an eyebrow when he saw the name on the tenant ledger. I didn't flinch. "Make the offer," I said calmly, tucking my scarf tighter around my neck. And just like that, Mrs. Langford, former extra mouth to feed, was about to become her daughter's landlord. Empires don't always rise in noise and neon. Some grow in silence, brick by brick, behind names people forget, until it's far too late. The office smelled like leather and old confidence. Thick carpet, frosted glass, a view of the skyline just blurred enough to feel expensive. Carter sat across from me, jacket draped over the back of his chair, tie loosened just enough to show he didn't need to impress anyone anymore. We'd done this dance before, years ago. But this time, I was alone. No George at my side, no co-signature, no approving nod from the man who used to trace my initials beside his on every dotted line. Just me, Elaine Langley. Or, as the papers had it, Langford Holdings, sole member and managing partner. The folder was already open when I arrived. The numbers had been scrubbed, verified, negotiated to within an inch of their lives. There were no surprises. And still, my hands hovered above the pen for just a breath too long. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't second-guessing. I was simply acknowledging the moment for what it was. A turning point. A private, poetic shift in the story I hadn't asked to be written into. At least, not in the way Amelia had cast me. From unwanted guest to property owner. From ghost in the guest room to the name on the deed. The documents were warm from the copier, a little too crisp. I smoothed the corner of the signature page, lined up the pen carefully, and signed in slow, practiced script. Elaine M. Langley. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but it was final. Carter gave a low whistle, tapping the table twice as if closing a performance. "Congratulations, Elaine," he said. "You own 314 West Maple." He paused. "Again? You sure about this?" "Absolutely." My voice didn't waver. "I just bought the building my daughter lives in." He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. Men like Carter understood that sometimes the best moves aren't about profit. They're about principle, about restoring what was chipped away. He knew enough not to press. Instead, he slid the deed across the table. I picked it up and tucked it neatly into my bag, right between my checkbook and a mint tin I hadn't refilled in weeks. As we stood to leave, Carter held the door for me. "Do you want me to notify the tenants?" he asked. "New landlord, updated management info, that kind of thing?" "Not yet," I said. "Let them live in their comfort a little longer." Because I wasn't coming in like a storm. I was coming in like the first cold wind before winter. Quiet, inevitable. And when the letters arrived, formal, courteous, and stamped with the seal of Langford Holdings, they wouldn't be personal. Just business. Just a change in ownership. Just a tripled rent. The kind of change that forces people to finally look up and ask, "Who owns the roof above our heads?" And they'd find my name. The one they'd forgotten. Until now. I didn't strut. I didn't announce it. There were no moving trucks or declarations. Just me, walking the hallway of a building I now owned, wearing the same beige coat Amelia had once called quaint, the same low-heeled shoes she had jokingly suggested donating. I passed a man on the second floor carrying a bag of groceries, and he gave me the tired nod of a fellow tenant. Not a clue. That was the beauty of it. No one saw me coming. I had chosen not to use a management firm right away. I wanted to see it for myself first, to feel the heartbeat of the building, the wear in the floorboards, the rhythm of the lives stacked behind these doors. I wanted to know what exactly my daughter thought was hers. I didn't knock. I didn't even glance too long at 3C, though I could hear the thump of children's feet against the floor, and Amelia's voice muffled behind the thin drywall that passed for privacy in these units. Her voice. It no longer froze me the way it used to. Now it reminded me of how small people can sound when they've convinced themselves they're important. I walked past her door like I would any other, because in that moment, that's all it was. Another door. Another tenant. Another name on my ledger. What she didn't know was that I'd already reviewed their lease. Month to month, no protections, no rent control. I had every right to raise the rent, or not renew. I could have issued a termination notice that same day and let the clock start ticking. But I didn't. Not yet. I wasn't interested in eviction. I was interested in awareness, in pulling the curtain back slowly, deliberately, until they could no longer pretend I was invisible. Instead, I posted the notices quietly the following week. Each one folded neatly, taped to the inside of the front door of every unit. Langford Holdings letterhead. Official tone. Rent adjustments effective 30 days from posting. Triple the current rate. No one saw me do it. By the time Amelia opened her door to fetch groceries and saw the paper hanging there, I was already across the street, sipping a tea on the bench in front of the florist shop. Watching. She stood frozen, reading it once, then again. Her face moved through the stages: confusion, disbelief, panic. She pulled out her phone and dialed quickly, pacing in socks on concrete like she'd forgotten her shoes in the urgency. I knew who she was calling. The number listed on the bottom of the notice rang to my new business line. I didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, I sat with my tea, letting the steam curl up toward my face like smoke from a match just struck. They'd wanted me gone. And now? Now I was here to stay. Not as their mother, as their landlord. Rent was due on the 1st, but the letter arrived 3 days before. I made sure of that. Timing, as always, mattered. Too soon, and they'd dismiss it as a mistake. Too late, and it might look vindictive. But right in that sweet spot, just enough time for confusion to curdle into panic, that's where the truth lands with the deepest echo. I watched from across the street, sitting at the bakery that faced the front of 314 West Maple. I ordered the same thing every morning now: black coffee, 1 sugar, no cream. The waitress knew my name, but not my story. "Here you go, Mrs. Langford," she'd chirp, and I'd smile like a woman with nowhere better to be. The tenants came out one by one, each holding the same folded envelope, the Langford Holdings seal crisp in the corner. Confused glances. A few muttered curses. One man shook the paper like the rent amount might change if he stared hard enough. But it was Amelia I was waiting for. Unit 3. C. The same unit I had once visited with a casserole dish in hand and hope in my chest. She appeared just past 10, bathrobe knotted loosely at the waist, one of the boys on her hip. She walked to the mailbox with the absent-minded routine of someone expecting nothing more than bills and junk. She never saw it coming. Not until her fingers curled around the envelope and her eyes caught the header. Langford Holdings. Her head tilted, confusion knitting her brows together like stitches pulled too tight. She opened it there on the stoop, standing in the patchy sunlight like someone reading a verdict. I knew the moment she reached the new rent amount. Her lips parted. Her free hand flew to her mouth, the way it used to when something broke in the kitchen, or she realized she'd forgotten a parent-teacher meeting. Only this wasn't forgettable. This wasn't fixable with an apology or a rushed explanation. She read the letter again, twice, then turned and stormed back inside, slamming the door hard enough for the bakery windows to shiver in their frames. The baby cried. Upstairs, a neighbor yelled something muffled through the walls. Life, messy and loud, kept moving. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter taste. Back at my motel, my business line had 4 missed calls, all from the same number. Heron, I didn't answer. I wasn't ready for that conversation, and besides, there was nothing to discuss. The letter had been clear. Rent would triple starting next month. Payment was expected in full. Any questions could be submitted in writing. This wasn't vengeance. It was accountability. It was the cost of forgetting who I was. The cost of calling me dead weight. They'd handed me my walking papers. Now I was handing them the bill. And for the first time in a long time, I felt paid in full. They say revenge is sweet. They're wrong. Revenge is loud, messy, and fleeting. It burns too hot, too fast, leaving behind little more than smoke and regret. What I wanted wasn't revenge. It was balance. A quiet, measured reordering of things. Not to hurt them, but to make them feel the weight of their choices. The same weight they'd heaped onto my shoulders when they decided I no longer fit into their lives. Tripling the rent wasn't a punishment. It was a correction, an invoice for the indignity they never knew they'd issued. The numbers weren't arbitrary, I had run them twice. What they were paying had been far below market value, a relic of an old agreement with the previous owner who hadn't bothered keeping up with inflation or property maintenance. I wasn't gouging anyone. I was aligning reality with responsibility. I was making sure that every extra mouth had a price. Amelia's first voicemail had been confusion laced with entitlement. "There's been a mistake," she said, her voice clipped. "You need to call the new landlord and sort this out before the kids get uprooted. I assume they don't know who you are." There it was again. That assumption. That belief that I was still powerless, still dependent, still some old woman in a guest room. She hadn't even realized the name on the letterhead was mine. The second voicemail arrived with the breathless tension of someone realizing the floor was starting to give way. "Mom, if you got this, please just... This rent hike, it's not fair. We can't afford that. You know we can't." Her voice cracked. She was starting to understand now. That life doesn't always protect you from your own cruelty. That comfort has a cost when it's built on someone else's pain. And the third? Silence. Just a sigh, soft and slow, before she hung up. No words. Just defeat. That one I listened to twice. I remembered the night I had left her house, 2 suitcases and nowhere to go. I remembered the way Greg never even looked up from his phone as I walked out the door. I remembered the slammed cabinet doors, the cold dinners, the sideways glances. I remembered being made to feel like a stranger in a home where I had once held Amelia's hair back while she vomited through morning sickness. Like all the years of motherhood could be dismissed with a tight smile and a change of subject. So no, it wasn't revenge. It was justice. Elegant, quiet, and legally binding. They wanted me gone. They wanted freedom. Now they had it. Freedom, after all, has a price tag. And mine came due on the 1st of the month, with interest. The first time Amelia said it, she was standing in the middle of the building's foyer, barefoot, hair tied up in a loose knot like she'd rushed down without thinking. The letter crumpled in her hand looked like it had been read, then reread, then squeezed into confession. Her voice echoed off the tiled walls, sharp with disbelief and the beginnings of fury. "You can't do this to family." The words hung in the air like smoke after a match is blown out. Too late to reverse the fire, too thick to ignore. I stood across from her, calm, coat buttoned neatly to the collar, the property manager's clipboard tucked under my arm like a shield. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply raised one brow. Family. That word had once meant everything to me. I'd built my life around it, sacrificed sleep, money, time, and dreams for it. I'd stood in emergency rooms, graduation halls, DMV lines, and late-night kitchens because of it. I had made family my religion, and motherhood my altar. But family, real family, doesn't place its mother at the curb with 2 suitcases. It doesn't call her dead weight behind closed doors, or make her feel like a trespasser in her daughter's home. And it certainly doesn't rediscover the sacred bonds of blood only when the rent triples. If you're still here, thank you. This part was the hardest to tell. I let the silence stretch just long enough. Then I answered, gently but clearly. "You're right. Family doesn't do this. But you stopped being family the moment you made me feel like I didn't belong." Her mouth opened, but no sound came. Because what was there to say? I wasn't doing anything unlawful. The building was mine. The lease was month to month. The rent adjustment had been well within my rights and carefully documented. No threats, no drama, just ink and legal paper. She hadn't expected me to fight back, let alone rise. "Mom, please," she said finally, her voice smaller now. "The kids, this'll tear everything apart." I nodded slowly, the same way I had when she was 6 and asking me why lightning scared her. then perhaps it's time you start teaching them how to respect the people who love them before it's too late. It was strange, really. The thing she had accused me of being, a weight, had become hers. The pressure of consequence, the heaviness of hindsight. And I wasn't cruel about it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't wave my success like a banner. I didn't need to. The truth did the work for me. She stood there a while longer, letter limp in hand, pride collapsing in on itself like wet paper. Then she turned, walked back up the stairs, and closed the door behind her. Not slammed, just closed. Software defeated. You can't do this to family, she had said. But family, real family, doesn't need to be reminded not to wound the ones who made them, especially not when the deed is in her name. It arrived 3 days after our confrontation in the foyer. Folded neatly, slid beneath my motel room door like some fragile peace offering smuggled under cover of dusk. No return address, no envelope, just my name scribbled across the top of the page in Amelia's handwriting. That same hurried script she'd used on thank you cards in college and grocery lists she left taped to the fridge. I recognized it instantly, of course. The slant of the L in Langley, the slight curve in her Y. Funny how memory clings to the details that once made you soft. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Not because I didn't want to read it, but because I already knew what it would say. I unfolded the paper slowly, like it might crumble if I moved too fast. The ink was smudged in places, not from tears, I suspected, but because she'd pressed the pen down too hard, trying to force sincerity onto the page. Mom, it began. Just Mom. No dear. No warmth. I'm writing because I don't know what else to do, it said. I didn't mean to hurt you. Things just got overwhelming. The kids, Greg's job, the house. It's a lot. I guess I didn't realize how much you were carrying too. It read less like an apology and more like a confession of inconvenience. She didn't say she was sorry for the words that cut deepest. Not for calling me dead weight. Not for pushing me out without dignity. She was sorry for how things turned out. A passive apology, like she'd tripped over a sidewalk crack and expected me to say it was okay. I miss how things used to be, she wrote, before everything got complicated. Complicated. That was her word for betrayal now. I hope we can talk, maybe find some middle ground. There was no mention of the rent increase, no offer to meet me halfway. Just that vague plea for reconciliation built on the shaky foundation of, let's move on, as if time could smooth over what she'd never truly faced. I folded the letter carefully and set it on the nightstand. I didn't rip it up. I didn't answer it either. Because some words deserve more than ink and hesitation. They require change. They require ownership. What she wanted wasn't reconciliation. It was reset. A way to return to the version of me that stayed quiet, grateful, and small. But that woman was gone. Elaine Langley had signed a deed. She owned a building. She had power, presence, and the means to walk away and never look back. The letter didn't move me. It didn't melt anything. If anything, it confirmed what I already knew. Amelia didn't want forgiveness. She wanted comfort. And comfort, like rent, now had a price. I tucked the letter into a drawer, unopened from that point forward. A keepsake, perhaps. Not of remorse, but of the moment she finally realized I wasn't coming back. Not as her mother, only as her landlord. It started with silence. Not the kind they used to punish me with. The kind that made rooms colder and dinners shorter. This silence was different. It was the stillness that follows a shift in gravity. The hush before people realize the ground they stood on no longer belongs to them. I felt it in the way Amelia's voicemails stopped, in the way Greg stopped storming out the front door like a man making statements, and in the way the blinds at 3C remained shut longer in the mornings. They were adjusting, not to me, but to the power I now held. They had pitied me once. That was the part that stung most deeply. It was never open hostility. No, pity is sharper, more elegant in its cruelty. They pitied my worn shoes, my careful voice, the way I asked permission to use a stove I once paid to replace. They pitied my presence like it was a lingering illness that had overstayed its welcome. But power, real power, doesn't announce itself. It waits. It watches. It moves through contracts and signatures, through the quiet authority of ownership. And as they scrambled to adjust their finances, to plead for leniency with the building manager, who answered only to me, they began to feel the slow erosion of control. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flaunt my wealth. I simply enforced the terms of the lease. Unit 2B moved out first. A single mother, polite, respectful, who shook my hand and said, "No hard feelings, you're just doing business." I waived her final month's increase. Not out of guilt, but because dignity should be rewarded where it's shown. Greg, I heard, had picked up a second job. A consulting gig that kept him out late and woke him early. The same man who once left his dishes for me to clean, now dragged himself through 16-hour days, trying to scrape together enough to cover their new reality. Amelia, for once, was quiet. Not humbled, but shaken. She no longer carried herself with that rigid spine of someone who thought kindness was a currency she controlled. I saw her once at the mailbox. She looked up. Our eyes met. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Nothing to say. Nothing to offer. I smiled. Not out of spite, but because I had finally returned to myself. The woman who built portfolios, who signed leases, who negotiated and strategized while rocking a baby to sleep on her hip. I was never weak. I was never a burden. I had just been buried under years of sacrifice, softened by love until they mistook it for frailty. Now I stood on the bones of their assumptions, not vindictive, just unshakable. From pity to power is not a loud transformation. It's a quiet rise, a rebalancing. A woman setting her crown back on her own head without asking for permission. And I didn't just rise. I owned the building I rose in. It was a crisp Tuesday morning when the moving truck backed into the narrow alley behind 314 West Maple. I recognized the sound immediately. That mechanical whine of gears shifting and wheels grinding against cracked asphalt. I'd heard it a dozen times over the years, usually followed by cardboard boxes, sweaty arguments about sofa angles, and the crash of something too fragile packed too carelessly. But this time, the sound rang different. Final. Faded. I didn't need to ask who was leaving. I already knew. Amelia hadn't said a word, not directly. But the silence had become louder by the week. Rent day had come and gone without a payment, and the grace period had bled into polite warning letters. There was no plea this time, no voicemail asking for understanding. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when pride won't allow you to beg and shame has tied your hands behind your back. They moved out early that morning. I watched from my usual bench across the street, coffee in hand, wrapped in the same beige coat she once laughed at. Greg loaded the truck, jaw clenched tight, while Amelia stood to the side, arms folded, eyes on the sidewalk like it might crack open and swallow her whole. The boys ran in circles, oblivious to the weight of cardboard and broken pride. By noon, they were gone. The building felt lighter without them. Not happier, just clearer. Like a room that's been aired out after too long of holding its breath. 3 days later, the new tenant arrived. Her name was Nora Patel. Early 40s, single. Marketing executive with a French press in one hand and a planner in the other. She toured the unit, nodded thoughtfully at the exposed brick and south-facing windows, and signed the lease on the spot. No haggling, no hesitation. She even complimented the lighting. "I love this place," she said, beaming. "Feels like a fresh start." I smiled. It's good for that. She didn't know the ghosts that lingered in 3C. She didn't know that the walls once echoed with cold dinners and sharper silences. That this was where a mother was turned into a tenant and then discarded like excess furniture. All she saw was possibility. A clean slate. As we finished the paperwork, she asked, "Are you the owner?" "Yes," I replied, carefully placing the final page into the folder. "Elaine Langley. I manage the property." "Well, Elaine," she said, shaking my hand with a firm grip and a genuine smile. "You've got a good thing going here." I nodded, feeling something loosen in my chest. "Thank you. I think so too." As she unpacked that afternoon, laughter spilled through the open window. Hers, free and unburdened. And in that moment, I knew that 3C wasn't just a former wound. It had become a beginning. Not just for Nora, but for me too. The first night in my new home, I slept with the windows open. The air was crisp, laced with the distant hush of city life. The occasional bark of a dog, the soft hum of tires over wet pavement, the rhythmic breath of a place that moved without demanding anything of me. I lay there under clean sheets, the ones I'd chosen myself, not inherited from someone else's linen closet. The silence wasn't empty. It was earned. It wasn't grand. A second-floor unit in a modest brick building I had bought years ago but never lived in. Back then, it had been just another asset. 4 units, low turnover, easy maintenance. But now it was something different. Now, it was mine in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Not a borrowed room, not a guest bed, not a corner I made myself small to occupy. This was my space. Every square inch of it carried no history but my own. No one else's resentment lingered in the paint. No whispered judgments clung to the corners. I made tea that first morning without tiptoeing. I used the nice dishes because there was no one to tell me to save them for someone else. I put on music, Billie Holiday, soft and slow, and let her voice curl into the kitchen while the kettle steamed. I sat at the little dining table beside the window, sunlight spilling across the surface, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was in someone else's life. There's something sacred about solitude when it's chosen. I answered to no one. I moved when I pleased, cooked what I liked, read past midnight without fearing I'd be too loud. There was no one to shrink for, no one to appease. Just me. And the woman I'd remembered being, sharp, capable, quietly powerful, she filled the space again. Not as an act of defiance, but as a return. I hung old photographs on the walls, ones that had been tucked away during my time at Amelia's. George holding a fishing rod, laughing with sunburned cheeks. Amelia at 5, missing 2 teeth, holding a popsicle like it was treasure. Me, 27, in a navy pantsuit, arms crossed, standing in front of my first office building. I looked into that photo often, not to reminisce, but to remind. That woman had never really left. She had simply gone quiet. And now, she had her room back. I didn't need chandeliers or vaulted ceilings. I didn't need to prove anything with marble countertops or imported rugs. What I had was privacy. Peace. A locked door that didn't need to be earned or begged for. A mailbox with my name on it. A life curated, not tolerated. They had reduced me to a burden. But now, in the stillness of my own space, I had become something far more dangerous. A woman with nothing to prove, and everything she needs. The morning Amelia showed up unannounced, I had just finished steeping a pot of Earl Grey. The good kind, loose leaves, not bagged. I'd set the tray with 2 cups, as if I had known she was coming, though I hadn't. Maybe something in me had anticipated the final note, the quiet epilogue to a story that had unraveled without apology. She stood at my door in a coat too thin for the weather, clutching a paper bag like it might excuse her presence. Her eyes were tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but the kind that settles in the bones when life has held up a mirror you can no longer ignore. "I was nearby," she said, which was a lie. My new place was miles from anywhere she'd go by accident. I opened the door anyway. We sat in the small living room, the tea between us steaming gently, untouched. She looked around with that same assessing gaze she used to wear in department stores, but now it landed differently. There was no criticism in her silence, just realization that I had made a life, that I didn't need saving, that I had never truly needed her at all. "I wanted to say, I know I didn't treat you right," she said finally, voice low. "And I'm sorry for how I spoke, for how I acted." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't wrapped in tears or theatrics. It was small, almost reluctant, but it was real. And sometimes, the quietest acknowledgments mean the most. I didn't rush to fill the space. I let it sit. I sipped my tea. It was sweetened with honey, my favorite, and it reminded me of the afternoons I used to spend alone in the garden, long before I moved into her home, long before I forgot who I was. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she added, "keeping control, protecting the kids, the house, everything." She paused. "But I was cruel and blind." I looked at her then, not as my daughter, not as the woman who had pushed me out of her home and into the world with nothing but silence and a suitcase. I looked at her as someone who had finally seen what she had broken, and what had refused to stay broken. "I don't hate you," I said gently, "but I won't shrink again to make you comfortable." She nodded. There were no protests, no justifications, just a soft exhale and the slow reach for her teacup. We drank in silence. There was no triumph in it, no gloating, just peace. The kind that comes when the scales finally balance. Not because I forced them to, but because I refused to tip them with my silence any longer. Justice, I've learned, doesn't always come with fury. Sometimes it arrives with tea and honey, and the quiet pride of knowing you didn't have to raise your voice to be heard. In the end, I didn't need to take anything from them. I simply reclaimed what was always mine: my voice, my space, my dignity. They had tried to reduce me to a burden, forgetting that I once built empires while they were still learning to walk. I didn't rise in anger. I rose in silence, in strength, in certainty. And as they adjusted to the reality of who I truly was, I finally found peace. Not in revenge, but in balance. I was never just an extra mouth. I was the woman who owned the building they thought they ruled. Quiet, unshakable, free. Thank you for watching. Her story is one of survival, truth, and finally choosing herself. To hear more stories like this, click on the left, and make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. You are not alone in what you've lived.